Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by firebomber pilot and flight instructor David Gagliardi. He talks about fighting wildfires from a DC-6, lessons learned from checkrides, and great Canadian airports. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hi everyone, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archives. And remember, you can send us an email with your comments, questions, and guest ideas at podcast@sporties.com. Today, I'm excited to welcome David Gagliardi to the podcast. He and I have worked together on PilotWorkshops Mastery scenarios in the past, and while working with him, I came to appreciate the unique flying career he has enjoyed. He has worked as a flight instructor, a charter pilot, cargo pilot, Transport Canada inspector, and perhaps most interestingly, as a firebomber pilot, or maybe more technically, an aerial forest fire suppression pilot. In that role, he's flown piston airliners like the DC-6 and the Convair 580, but David has also flown aerobatics, seaplanes, gliders, and warbirds, and currently flies a Nanchang CJ-6A. As if that weren't enough, he's also had a 3-decade career in the Naval Reserve. David, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
All right, thanks for inviting me.
I want to start with your time fighting forest fires, something a lot of Americans got an education on earlier this year with the terrible fires in Los Angeles. I think that hit people's radar maybe for the first time in a while. So help us understand the overall plan for fighting a forest fire, and what do airplanes add to that mix? Where does that come into the plan?
Well, first of all, there's 2 ways of aerial forest fire suppression. One is you use a amphibious aircraft to scoop water and then drop it right on the fire. The other way is you use a chemical retardant and you drop it around the edge of the fire to stop it from spreading. The 2 can be used together at the same time. The general problem with water bombing, so scooping, is the water has to be close to the fire. The general rule of thumb is 5 minutes of flying time. Otherwise, you can't put enough water fast enough to make any difference. And so because a lot of the areas of North America don't have lakes adjacent, we tend to have retardant bombing in the west. And then in the east, Ontario, Minnesota, Quebec, those areas are mostly water bombing with just scoopers. So my whole career has been on the land-based retardant bombing on the western part of Canada and Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, and into Alberta and Saskatchewan.
And I would imagine the mission briefing here is very detailed. So walk us through that process. What do you do before you go flying to prepare for the mission?
Well, there's I guess 2 levels. So there's a spring training session, which is designed to get everyone up to speed. So both to meet the regulatory requirements for the check rides for the airplanes, but also to practice the procedures. The actual fire is basically tactical military procedures. So you sit on the base waiting for the horn to go off, or later a text message on your BlackBerry. As an aside, we all assigned the Johnny Cash song "Burning Ring of Fire" to that number. So whatever there was a dispatch, all of a sudden the foes would all start squawking to that. But then we have 5 minutes to get in the airplane, and it's all done on the fly. So and I guess I'll back up a little bit. There is a difference between Canada and the U.S. Canada dispatches with electronically. The U.S. dispatches what we call orders. So they give you a piece of paper, but basically it's the same. So you jump in the airplane, flash up. The idea is to be airborne in 5 minutes. And then all you get is a location of the fire. And so on the way, they will dispatch a lead plane, or what we call in Canada a bird dog, which is a forward air controller. And so they're responsible for developing the plan. So they'll get there first. They'll scope out the fire. They'll talk to people on the ground and then figure out where the most effective use of the retardant could be. So sometimes that involves putting the retardant right on the fire, although more normally we would try to stop the fire from spreading. So you lay some retardant in front of it so the wind would come up against the retardant. Or sometimes you may want to try to steer the fire. So if there's an area of scrub or low value or nothing, is you start working the flanks, and then that kind of steers the fire into no fuel, and then it goes out on its own. So a lot of it depends on the scenario. As a general rule, the smaller the fire, the better this works. And our our goal in Canada was 1 hectare, so 1,000 meters square or less is the ideal to work, because then we can get around it with one load with a large bomber. Sometimes, of course, that doesn't work, or the fire gets away, and then we tend to with what we call campaign fires. It's more about working around edges or trying to protect particular values on the side, but it's really important, though, that this is one tool in the fire toolbox. And so we don't generally put fires out. It's the troops on the ground that do that. And so we assist the broader firefighting firefighting actions. But the guys on the ground are the ones, frankly, that have my respect. My job's easy compared to theirs. And but it's amazing what they can do on the ground, and then we support that as well. So it's all a big team, and everybody works together to hopefully save the forest, save values, and go home safe.
Well, none of it sounds easy to me, but part of it as a pilot that I think sounds particularly difficult is the situational awareness part of this. So you've got to fly the airplane, obviously. You've got to keep an eye on where the fire is. You've got to keep an eye on the other airplanes. So how do you maintain that situational awareness when you're flying a mission like this, and especially when there's terrain or smoke? How do you keep that big picture view?
Actually, from a pure flying perspective, the lead pilot has the hardest job because he will scope out the area. So he has to visually acquire all of the cues on the ground, talk on the radio, and he can be monitoring up to 4 frequencies. And then he will fly the bombing run to check out for any dangers, snags, rising ground, bad exits. And so basically we just show up overhead, watch what he does, and then follow behind him. So the flying part is actually relatively straightforward, because you've already had a pre-planned route. There is in the States an ability for the tankers to do initial attack where they're on their own, but in Canada we don't allow that. But in any case, generally the plan is understood, and you kind of know where you need to go. So you just fly a big circle, left-hand circle, so that you're on the right side of the airplane to see the fire, and then just do a descending orbit, line up on final, pick up the cues, and again, they often the lead plane will give you. They have a smoke generator, so they'll leave a little trail of smoke, so you have something to cue on. And then depending on what you're doing, often it's a tag on and extend, so there's already a turn on the ground, which is red, which shows up pretty well. So you just line up with that, and then when you get to the end of it, release your load and carry on. It's all visual. There's no aids. So when there's strong winds or a curving approach, there's a bit of bodying that's required on the part of the pilot, but that comes with experience. So the challenge I would suggest is more the pure flight part. You're flying a big airplane close to the ground and banked. We used to joke, not only are you allowed to fly close to the ground and steep bank, you have to. So, the last airplane I was in, Electra, 110,000 pounds, they were 125 knots, 150 feet over the trees. So the margins are less, obviously. And so you have to really be thinking about where the airplane's going and preserving the energy of the airplane, not getting into a low energy state. But it's well choreographed. We've been doing it for a long time. And so I think it's kind of well understood procedures. And if you follow them, and you stay safe. Smoke can definitely be an issue. That's, I think, probably the most challenging conditions. You try to stay out of it, but sometimes you can't. And so that can be scary when you start losing visibility close to the ground. But often, actually, the most dangerous part is not the fire; it's getting to the fire. When you have to navigate smoke-filled valleys, and there may be tons of other airplanes zooming around, and so That can actually be more concerning than actually working overhead the fire where everything is all contained.
Well, you mentioned you fly some unique airplanes here. You're not doing this in a Cessna 180. You've flown 60-year-old radial engines. You've flown, DC-6s, Convairs. You mentioned the Electra. So what's harder about doing it in those airplanes? Large airplanes, older airplanes? Is it systems manage it? Is it the stick and rudders you mentioned, the load factor? What is the thing that you work most on?
Well, I think the large airplanes are all two crew, which is great because you can, the guy driving can just concentrate on looking out the window, and the other guy can manage the whole airplane. That's a really important in the DC-6 because engine management is quite demanding. And I mean, my first go as a 6, I flew as a co-pilot. The first year, I never looked out the window. There was just so much to do. And then, as I got a better feel for the airplane, I could help out. But the single pilot machines are a bit harder, but then they're smaller. So it's kind of a trade-off. The big issue with the large airplanes is just they're big and they have inertia. And so you have to make sure that you don't get into a situation where you start losing energy and you can't get it back fast enough, especially close to the ground. Your turning circle's bigger. Just everything is bigger and heavier. So it takes a bit more planning. Was a very nimble airplane. I remember doing one fire up in Yukon, circling down a bowl at 85 knots. So the airplane was carrier based, so it had very good low speed characteristics. So it was more handy, I guess, more maneuverable. So, but then I was single pilot, so there's a trade-off again there about having to do everything yourself.
And what's the unique personality of those airplanes? DC-6, Convair, Electra, they have their own quirks and personality you get to know?
Well, they're all old, and they're all actually from a different generation. The thing I think everyone appreciated is they built airplanes like tanks back then. And so they were really tough, big airplanes, and they all flew on the wing. And so they were I thought, very honest flying airplanes. The DC-6 is probably my favorite airplane of all time. And I got 80-ish types in my logbook. It was the DC-6B at the very end of the big piston, and it was a very refined airplane. And I just love the big engines. The airplane would, you set up for cruise, you pull the props back, and you got this wonderful low growl, and it was just a cool airplane, but very pleasant to fly. Even though it was huge and all physical controls, there's no boosted controls. It was quite well balanced and just had a really nice control feel, and it's just such a cool airplane. So I loved it.
Yeah, DC-6B may be the best looking airliner ever built. In my totally biased opinion, I just think that's a great looking airplane. If you've ever seen one of the rare instances where one of those comes out at an air show, it stops you cold in your tracks when you see that, I think. So how do I get started in this, David? If I'm interested in this, I mean, is this an apprentice model? Do I go to school for it? How do I get involved in firebombing?
Well, there's no entry-level jobs. I was hired by my company with 3,600 hours, big round engine time already, mountain time. And I was one of the lower time guys they hired.
Wow.
You really need the flying has to be automatic because so much else is happening. And so there's really no apprentice jobs. There's no kind of step up. Even the bird dog or lead plane, which is a small airplane at King Air or Aerostar or something like that, still you can't be thinking about flying the airplane and do your job. And so you need significant experience. Certainly, if you're working in the West, mountain time, low altitude time. Ag guys are fairly common. I think they bring a good skill set. Fair number of military people with low-level tactical operations fit in quite well. The actual pilot pool isn't huge. A lot of it tends to be word of mouth. That's how I got on. I was recommended by another pilot who knew me, who had a connection to the company. So I think typically that's how people get involved. It is tough lifestyle. My company, which I think was typical, had basically two kinds of pilots. The general rule of thumb is if you made it to year 5, you were a lifer. But we actually had a fair number of folks, quite good pilots and quite competent, who only lasted a year or two because of the lifestyle. I did one summer, where I was on base pretty much every day except for mandatory days off, and we only flew 27 hours. So there was a huge amount of sitting around with nothing to do. And, the joke at the tanker base is you eat till you're sleepy, you sleep till you're hungry. But if you have to be able to occupy yourself. But when the bell goes off or the pager goes off, it is the coolest flying I think that's available in civilian aviation. And with a military background in the Navy, to me it was the best of all worlds. It's all the good parts about the military without all of the bad parts, the paperwork and all the bullshit staff stuff and all that.
And what's the future of this look like? I mean, in the U.S., there's some larger jets you'll occasionally see who are doing these firebombing runs. Is it drones? I mean, what does this world look like in 10 years?
That's a good question. I think there's a place for drones, but the capacity piece matters, right? And so there is a minimum quantity of retardant below which it just isn't worth it. And so, like 1,000 gallon or 800 gallons is kind of the cutoff. So I think it's going to be a while before you see drones. The other part is kind of the economic reality. One of the reasons you see all these old airliners is because the airframes are cheap. And so, you have a big airplane, but you only use it a couple of 100 hours a year. And so the rest of the time it's just sitting around. And so it's hard to justify having an expensive airframe when you only use it a bit. And even if you can have a more round the year fire like you see in the southern states, it's still, I think, hard to justify really big capital outlay out front. And so I think the current mix is going to hang around for a while. And then there's some niche roles. There is work being done on using night vision to work at fires at night. Personally, I think that's really scary, but there are definite advantages. The fire lays down at night, so you can work areas you couldn't. I think what's always worked best is having more tools in the toolbox. And so what I think you're seeing now is kind of a stretch from each end, at the bottom end, like an Air Tractor 802 with 800 gallons, and at the other end, at DC-10 with 12,000. And, I can certainly think of fires where that big tanker was the perfect machine. Big grass fires, you could just one load right across the front, done. Whereas a smaller tanker, you can't get all the way across and the fire burns around the edge and you just go back and forth and you get the zigzag of fire lines. So it's a where I think there's probably room for improvement, or not maybe improvement, or make more effectiveness, is coordinating all the various bits. So you're starting to see more like a military command and control system to manage the assets better. And so I think that will make it more effective. But at the end of the day, so we're only one part of the National Forest fire suppression effort. And, unfortunately, there does seem to be feelings that, just send in the airplanes and your problem will go away. And that's not the case at all. And, we kind of joke sometimes about what we call political retardant, where people want to see airplanes on the 6 o'clock news, but that's generally not as effective as it could be used in a more coordinated way. But you do what you do. And ultimately, we work for the agencies, and they have operational control, and we put the retardant where they tell us to.
Fascinating world, David. Thanks for giving us a look into that. Yeah. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to switch gears and talk about your time as an instructor and a pilot examiner. Hey, pilots, let's be honest. Once you pass your check ride, flying isn't just about checklists and maneuvers. It's about making smart decisions and adjusting when things don't go as planned. That's where VFR and IFR Mastery from Pilot Workshops come in. Every month, you'll get brand new flying scenarios, one for VFR pilots and one for IFR pilots, designed to challenge your decision-making skills in a safe, risk-free environment. Led by Pilot Workshops' award-winning team of flight instructors, these scenarios focus on practical flying tips and real-world strategies that make you a more confident, more prepared pilot. Whether it's handling tricky weather, navigating unexpected airspace issues, or making tough go, no-go calls, Mastery helps sharpen the skills you actually use in the cockpit. It's more than just reading an article or watching a video. It's a multi-step, interactive experience that even includes a community section where you can talk with other pilots about their decision-making process. I've been a panelist for Mastery, and I can tell you it's one of the most educational and fun experiences of my aviation career. So I invite you to join thousands of other pilots who rely on these expert insights to stay sharp. Sign up for a free trial of VFR or IFR Mastery today at pilotworkshops.com and take your flying to the next level. That's pilotworkshops.com. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion. We are back with David Gagliardi, who spent many years as an instructor and then an inspector for Transport Canada. David, I know in those roles you've done a lot of check rides, both for initial certificates, kind of your classic private pilot check ride, but also for professional pilots and some check rides beyond just the normal. So what are the differences you've seen there, either in terms of how the check ride goes or how the candidates prepare? Is there anything we can learn from that?
Well, first off, I'd like to state that, my opening position is success. Right? I want them to pass or to be successful. And so if they can't make the standard, then that's disappointing to me. I'd much rather be part of a successful ride than not. And so, I know maybe there are examiners out there that like failing people, but that's certainly not been my experience. I think everyone I've dealt with in the examiner world and check pilot world want people to succeed. And so, the check pilot or examiner isn't your enemy. You work as a team to get the mission done, which in this case is to demonstrate your proficiency. So I think that's a good mindset to start with. I think kind of obvious, but the preparation for the flight test really kind of sets yourself up to succeed or fail. And if I have a moment, a kind of funny story. So I was doing a check ride on a Navajo for a Part 135 equivalent. And at the time, this is 30 years ago, all the rides were done by Transport Canada inspectors. And the one I was given had a reputation for being stone-faced. Like a good guy, but he didn't. So I was mostly flying the freighter Navajo, and so the crew door is over the wing. But this flight test was in the Chieftain, which has an extended fuselage. And so the door is actually a bit further forward. And so we all get in, and the weather wasn't great. We were going from Victoria to Vancouver, and I was going to drop them off there. And then we had to do some VFR work. And I realized I didn't have a VFR chart. So I'm sitting in the airplane just about to start up, and I realized, well, I really shouldn't be flying around because we're going to break the IFR flight plan into a VFR segment. So I turned to him and say, you know what? I'm sorry. I forgot to bring my VFR chart. I'm just going to run out and get it. So I leap out of the cockpit, except the wing isn't there. So my foot's up on the door sill. My hands are behind my head on the nacelle, and I'm bent in a U. And I still remember the inspector kind of leads over, one eyebrow kind of goes up and down, and he says, "Are you okay?" So I thought, oh, what a great way to start the ride. And anyway, so I I'd tangle myself running, get the chart and all back, say, sorry about that. And he says, and I still remember this word, and which I used in flight tests. He looks at me and says, Dave, I don't care what happened 5 seconds ago. All I care about is what's happening in the future. So put that behind you and do a good flight test. And, I think that's a really powerful lesson, because unfortunately I've seen flight tests both in the licensing, private and commercial, and in the professional world, where flight test is going okay, a maneuver doesn't go so well, and the candidate obsesses about it, and then it just turns into a spiral and it all ends badly. So, if it doesn't go great, you just have to put it in the rear view and concentrate on doing well on the next one. And I think the examiner, if the examiner is going to tell you whether the ride's over or not, and if he doesn't say it's over, keep going. And I've certainly seen folks who where it's maybe started a bit ropey, but then kind of all came together, and I was quite happy at the end. So don't fail yourself. I know that's easy to say, but it is an important consideration, I think. And I expect people to be nervous, particularly at the early stages. But that is, though, life, right? I mean, you are going to be put in situations as a pilot. And kind of another funny bit was I was doing an inspection on an air operator, and they had some small airplanes, and one of them was a Charky 6. And as I walk in the front door, the airplane pulls up on the ramp. So I think, well, I'll just start with a ramp. So the young guy gets out and really nervous. And I say, hey, no worry, they've got to check this. Let's go through it. And so I, break the ice, what's your name and where are you from and how long have you been working for this? He says, oh, this is my first day on the job. So poor guy gets wrapped on his very first day of his very first job as a commercial pilot. So I felt kind of bad about that, but it was all fine. But anyway, but again, though, that's reality. You have to deal with it. And in the end, I was quite impressed with him because, he had his ducks in a row, and he gave a good brief to me on what he had. He was able to show me all the stuff I needed to see. And, I was able to give him a good thumbs up. So good on him.
Yeah, the checkride is nobody's idea of fun, but if you're on that professional pilot track and you want to be an airline pilot or a charter pilot, that is going to be your life for the foreseeable future. You're going to be taking check rides every 6 months in a lot of cases. So I've often given the advice to new pilots, learn to, if not love the check ride, then at least make peace with it and endure it, because that's just going to be a regular fact of life, like going to the dentist for you. So there's no point in getting overly stressed about it.
Yeah, and I think the other part too is you will get a whole bunch of different check pilots, and I've had tons of little nuggets from them that made me a better pilot. And so, I always ask at the end of my rides, after kind of it's all done, kind of more informal, hey, do you see things that I should work on? Or, do you have any ideas on how to do something better? Or, and most of these folks are really happy to share their experience, and especially when you have a more junior pilot. And I think back in my earlier days in my commercial career, I got some really good tips from folks. So I looked at it as a learning opportunity. And in fact, there was one examiner, a transport account examiner, and, we used to joke it's because at that point, flying an instructor or a flight test only cost $40. He said it was the best $40 of flight training you'll ever get, because the guy was a been there, done that, gazillion hour, and just a great guy. And he always had some really good feedback, and, some of which I still use. So that's, I think, a better way to look at the ride, as an opportunity to make yourself a better pilot.
Great advice. You also had some great advice a few years ago. You wrote an article about forced landings. And to me, you were posing the question of, are we really teaching pilots to handle engine failures, or are we just teaching them to memorize a maneuver? So what is the right way we should be teaching engine failures and forced landings in primary training?
Well, the first problem is we're teaching to the flight test. And so the flight test starts by necessity with the examiner pulling the throttle back, right, and saying engine failed. Well, when you think about it, let's see, we just did a full walk around. We drained the tanks. We checked for contaminants. We checked quantity. We did a full run up to confirm the engine was working fine. We checked that we had full power available when we took off, and we're flying along and we're checking that the engine gauges are all appropriate. And then the engine fails. That is the absolute least likely scenario to actually happen to you ever. Paul Bertorelli had an excellent podcast about how engine failures actually happen. And 60% of them are caused by the actions or inactions of the pilot. And I had a particularly I guess, aha moment for me is not long after I started instructing, one of the pilots in the school that I worked at, he got wasn't my student, but he got his license and bought an airplane. And he was flying back from an airport a couple of weeks later, and the engine failed. And he crammed it into this nasty little cut block in a forest. Did quite an excellent job of flying to put in the only available spot. Airplane was wrecked, but nobody was hurt. When they collected the wreckage, the left fuel tank had 10 gallons, the right fuel tank had 0 gallons, and the selector was on the right tank. And the engine failed at 3,000 feet above ground. And so what had happened was, because in flight training, the engine never restarts after you check it, everyone just kind of rushes through the checks and then concentrates on flying the perfect forced landing, the first approach. And if he had just taken that 10 seconds to do the flow, he would have switched, would have kicked himself or smacked himself upside the head and said, dummy, switched the fuel over, and the engine would have sprung back to life and he would have flown home. And so, that really kind of raised the question. And then I look at myself. I've had 9 engine failures in various airplanes over my career, where the engine failed. But the last one wasn't a failure. It was in my Nanchang. It was a partial failure. And it was the hardest one to deal with of all the ones. So it started with the engine RPM starting to hunt. I'm thinking, well, that's not right. And I was leading a 4-ship formation at the time. And so I said, well, that's not right. So started to turn towards home, and then the engine burped. And so I got rid of all the other guys, the second element, pushed my wingman to chase and declared emergency and started home, which is about 18 miles away. And as I was going, the engine would burp, but not stop. So I climbed slowly and pointed at the airport and, and put a few wiggles to keep fields in view. And then I was given a straight in to the runway, which was basically in front of me. And so I cut the corner and headed right for the runway. And then the engine stopped. And then it came back to life 3 seconds later. And then it stopped again. And then it came back to life. And I literally didn't know what to do at this point. And I couldn't make the field because it was too far back. And then it came back to life and it stayed running.
Wow.
And so I made the end of the stayed high. And then when I had gliding distance, pulled the throttle back, engine stopped, put the wheels down, landed, rolled, no biggie. But it was, if the engine had just stopped, I have the whole memorized, pre-planned actions. But when the engine stopped and then without me doing anything, came back to life and then stopped again, I was really kind of at a loss what to do. And so I still remember that moment of, abject confusion. And so it's really important, I think, that instructors talk about all of the possibilities, including shutting down the engine yourself. And one of the engine failures involved exactly that, where the engine was running, but it was cooking itself. It was a turbine. And so we shut it down. And so not a big deal on a 4-engine airplane, but there are certainly scenarios where the engine doesn't fail. You fail it deliberately by accident. Same thing if it was on fire. So I think it's really important that people talk about all of these options in flight training. And I make a point as an instructor that it starts with, after you trim the airplane for glide and point it at a field, you do a cause check or a flow. And if you don't do it completely, then the exercise stops right there. Then once you've established that, then that the engine isn't going to start, then you need to revert to, okay, now I've decided the engine isn't going to start. So now I don't think about the engine anymore. I think about flying the airplane. But that intermediate step, I think, is super important.
A lot of really good tips in there. I'll close by quoting your article because I think this sums it up well. I tell my students that when the engine fails, the insurance company just bought the airplane. The only consideration is the safety of the occupants. If the airplane can be saved, that's nice, but it should never be a consideration. And I think That's the way a lot of pilots feel, and it's hard to do it in the moment, but that's absolutely the right way to approach the scenarios. Don't try to be a hero and save the airplane, save the people on board. David, we always close the show with a lightning round we call Ready to Copy. So I'll ask some questions rapid fire style on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. You ready to copy?
Go ahead.
Describe your first firebomber mission in 5 words or less.
Panic.
1 word does the job. What skill is most essential for flying an old airplane like the DC-6?
Systems knowledge. The airplane doesn't have all sorts of systems to protect you, so you really have to understand how it works.
What is one piece of advice you'd like to give every applicant on their first check ride?
Be prepared. When you think you're prepared, go over everything again.
What is your favorite maneuver to teach as a flight instructor?
Crosswind landings.
And what is your favorite maneuver to check on a check ride?
Depends on the check ride, because of course there's a big one between a private pilot one and an aerobatic instructor one. But I think the run-up actually can be the most insightful as an examiner. It tests checklist discipline. It checks knowledge of the systems. It checks airmanship in terms of how you position the airplane first. It checks smoothness in terms of, do you jam stuff in or not? So it actually ticks a whole lot of boxes. And I used to do proficiency flights. So the flying club had a requirement to do an annual check ride. And I used to fill in the entire form based on what I saw on the check ride, just as kind of a mental exercise. And a lot of times I was pretty close.
Interesting. Very interesting. You came up what I would consider the traditional aviation career ladder, flight instruction, charter, cargo flying, all that kind of stuff. What did you learn flying charter and cargo, those Navajos you were talking about? What did you learn there that you just can't learn as a flight instructor?
The charter world will will force you into situations where you have to make decisions. And the decisions all will involve saying no. And they'll be really hard. And I think the flight instruction, you're kind of insulated from the really tough decisions. But the commercial world, the needle is at go, right? And you have to be able to say, no, sorry, that isn't going to happen. And I think that's where a lot of new pilots struggle, particularly with companies that, kind of put them under a bit of pressure.
What's the best advice you ever received as a pilot?
When I was, look at the gauges. When I was, if you have a moment here, when I was an instructor, brand new, I hung out the airport. And there was this gentleman, this is in the early 80s, there was this gentleman who had this beautiful polished square tail 172. And he had learned to fly in the 30s, World War II. Like, he was the poster child for being there, done that, and just a real gentleman. Anyway, he was out washing his airplane, and I was my student counsel, so I helped him polish it. And then we went for a spin. And the first thing I found hard to understand is how he could fly the airplane without moving the wheel, because the guy was so smooth. But then we used to fly a fair amount. And I remember one time we were flying along, and I was flying, and he put his hand over all the engine gauges and he said, "Tell me where all the needles are." And I said, "In the green?" He says, "No, you need to know where they are exactly, because that way, if they move a bit, then they will give you warning." And that saved me from an off-airfield forced approach when an oil pump failed on a Cessna 150, and I caught the declining oil pressure fast enough that we were able to get back to the airport.
Wow. I mentioned you fly that Nanchang CJ6A. What's the most unique feature of that unique airplane?
The air system. So everything is run by air. So the bad news is when you have an air leak, it really sucks because you open the hangar door and the floor is just covered in air. But no, it's the systems are completely different from anything I've ever had, and so. But it's cool, and but it's a wonderful airplane, beautifully built, very nice and light in the controls, makes great radial engine noises, and bang for the buck is the best bargain in warbird flying, in my opinion.
You live in British Columbia, a gorgeous part of Canada. Where's the best fly-in destination in that area? If I'm headed north of the border here, where should I check out in that area?
Tofino is definitely worth it. The airport is right next to a beautiful beach. It's about a 5-minute walk. Park on the ramp, walk down the road, and there's miles and miles of beautiful beach open to the west. Some of the interior airports are super pretty, although you need to be proficient in mountain flying. But that's a tough one to answer because there's just so many really cool spots to go. But I think an obvious one would be Tofino.
How about the other side of Canada? You grew up in Montreal, a fun and unique city in its own right. What's the best place to fly in the eastern side of Canada?
That's a bit of a tough one. There's lots of history, and especially in Quebec, because it was the first part of North America settled on the northern end. So lots of the towns around, smaller towns around, have airports near them and are accessible with a lot of history. Quebec City is a beautiful spot. Highly recommended to get to the old part of town. Yeah, it's a tough one. There's just a lot of small airports that are near the towns. Certainly north of Montreal in the Laurentians, there's some great airports around there. In the eastern townships, Bromont is really nice as well. So, like tons of spots.
You hit two on my list. I think Quebec City is somehow still underrated. It feels like you're in Europe, and it's an easy flight for anybody in the Northeast U.S. So many good places to go. So you had this parallel career in the Canadian Naval Reserve, and I would have to guess there are some things you learned there that helped you as a pilot. Can you think of something there that was directly applicable flying, whether it was decision-making or weather knowledge or something else there?
I think one of the things, so as I finished up my career, commanded a couple of a minesweeper and coastal patrol vessel, multi-role vessel. And so ships are run with a team. Like it's not like a pilot where you drive the machine, you have a whole group of people. And so I think the concepts of crew resource management are kind of baked into it from the beginning. And so I was always used to working with everybody to accomplish the mission. And I think that mindset was helpful in flying. So the ground crew, the engineers, of course, the other pilots, the folks that they're in the freight and they were handling the freight. So all of them contribute to the safety of the flight. And I think that mindset was maybe not absent in aviation, but not really there until fairly recently. So I think I was well prepared for that. The other one is making decisions without complete information. The equivalent of an in-flight weather decision, like you have the exact same issues in a ship, and you won't have all the information. But you still have to make a decision. And so I got used to working with a bit of uncertainty and navigation uncertainty or weather or conditions or whatever. And so I think that directly helped me be effective as a pilot.
That is such a great skill to learn for anything, flying, life, business, parenting, almost anything I can think of. Making decisions with incomplete information is what life is all about. It's pretty rare you actually have complete information and the answer is sitting there right in front of you. All right, David, our last question is always the same on pilot's discretion. You have one final flight and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Evening flight, 4-ship formation over Strait of Juan de Fuca. So you get on a sunny day, so you get the low light over the mountains, you get that kind of golden glow, you get the ocean, and you can look left and right, and there's the other 3 airplanes formation right there.
David, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.